In this lecture, we're going to take our basic understanding of animation and start using the timeline and record buttons. Okay, so I'm in a new startup file and I'm going to bring my timeline up so I can see all the details of what we're about to create. And I want to give you a quick challenge. With our basic cube that's currently selected, I want you to keyframe the scale so it starts off at its current size, scales to twice the size over half a second, and then comes back to its original size after a full second. Hopefully that makes sense. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered you need to keyframe the starting point. So with my mouse over the viewport, I can press I and keyframe this time the scale. Let's go across to 12 seconds. I can press S to scale and then 2 for twice the size and press enter. And you can see down here that the scale channels, so the X, Y, and Z are known as different channels. They've all got an orangey outline now. So there's some movement here, but I haven't yet set a keyframe. Now I can do it in the viewport here by pressing I and scale, but I can also do it down here by clicking these diamond icons at the end here for each channel. Now they've turned this sort of yellowy color, so we know there's a keyframe on those channels. Let's just quickly check that. If I click and drag my playhead across there, we can see it's animated the scale. So I need to go to frame 24 and I can of course type in the values here, and I can actually click and drag and type in the values here of 1 and press enter. So it goes back down and I can keyframe them just here as well. And I can scrub across my timeline and you can see that kind of looping scale. And because our end frame is the same as our beginning frame, if I set the end frame to 24, so 1 second, and press play, I can actually press the play button here or press spacebar. You can see this sort of pulsating cube looping animation here. So if your beginning frame and end frame are the same, you can loop your animations. And that will be important for later on. So I'll press the spacebar to pause the animation. And what I could have done, which is slightly easier, if I just select this end keyframe and delete it, notice that if I come to frame 24 now, it's in green instead of that yellow that we had. I can actually just select the beginning keyframe and press Shift D to duplicate and bring it to the end here. And notice how the size changed and it's now turned yellow, indicating there's a keyframe there. And we've also got these white diamonds now instead. And you can see as I scrub across my timeline or I press spacebar, we've got that looping animation once again. It's worth also pointing out that let's say I take this keyframe in the middle here and press Shift D to duplicate and move it over the top of the one in the middle. Don't follow along with this, but if I set that there and press spacebar, it's actually overwritten the keyframes that were there. We've just got a scale of 1, so it is animating, but they're all the same, so we're not actually seeing any animation. I'll pause the video and undo that, play again, make sure that's working, and it's scaling nicely. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. Now we're going to add to this animation, but this time we're going to use the timeline controls here. Notice that in the middle, we've got the play animation. We've also got the play in reverse, which is actually the same for us in this animation, but it can be very useful. We've also got jump to the next keyframe and the previous keyframe, as you can see here. And then there's jump to the end or the beginning of the animation. Before that, we've got a record button. Now this can be very useful. If I press the record button, it will record any movement that I do. So let's do exactly that. I want to not only have my cube scale, but also move up and down. Now the important thing when you press the record button, you have to actually remember to record the frame that you're on. So don't just move across to the next frame and start doing the next part of your animation because it hasn't recorded anything for this first frame. You have to let it know that you want to record something here. Let's say if I press G to grab and just press enter, you can see my keys for the location and the rotation, in fact, turn yellow and they're saying there's a keyframe on this spot. Even though I haven't actually moved anything, the record button was activated by me pressing G to grab and then pressing enter. We could also have pressed I and then inserted a keyframe here as well. Now the important thing to know though is that the record button records all the channels, so location, rotation and scale. You can tell it not to do that, but by default it records all the channels available. We can see those results more clearly if we open up the dialog box in the side of the timeline just here. At the moment we've just got a summary, which is in our scene. We know there are 3 keyframes of animation. If we open up that dialog box, we've got the cube animation here, and we know there's a keyframe for each of these frames indicated here. So it's sort of a hierarchy. We've got the summary of the whole scene, which we know there's animation in. We've got the cube. We know there's animation there. The next is the cube action. I'll talk about actions later, but you can have several actions on one object, but just ignore that for now, but it is another layer that's there. But after that, we've got the object transforms. And if I open those up, you can see each of the channels here. So there's the scale that's been animated, but also now the location, which we wanted because we want to move it up in a moment, but also the rotation has been keyframed as well, which we didn't really want, but we'll leave it in for now and we'll start changing these things around later on. So because I pressed G to grab and then enter, the record button activated as it were and set a keyframe for frame 1. So now I can go across to frame 12 and I'll just move out a touch and around the side here and press G, Z5. So it's moved up 5 Blender units. And notice when I pressed enter, it set a keyframe here automatically because we've got the record button on. I'll just zoom out a little bit more so we can see that. And then just to show off the record button a bit more, I'll come across to here, GZ-5 and press enter. And you can see it set a keyframe for all those channels. And if I press play, you can see this strange pulsating cube here, which kind of looks fun. Now, as I said before, we can easily write over these keyframes and add in a bit of animation. So a quick challenge to you, I want you to add in a little bit of rotation this time. So over the course of 1 second, I want you to rotate the cube so it does a full 360 rotation around the Z axis. But before you start this, do remember that the rotation has already been keyframed. So you may have to delete some keyframes and you may have to override some keyframes. So pause the video and have a go at that, but don't panic if it's not making sense because we'll do it together just in a moment. Okay, so we've got these 3 channels down the bottom which deal with rotation. Don't worry about the term Euler. It can get very confusing, but just for now, treat it in the same way you would your rotation channels over here. So currently, if I start at the beginning, it's got a keyframe of 0 rotation, which is correct, and that's what we want for our Z axis here. Then we go across, and it's got another keyframe at frame 12, which we don't need because we only need 2 keyframes, one at the beginning of 0 degrees and one at the end of 360, a full revolution. So I can select those keyframes here in the middle and press delete. Then I can either drag my playhead to the end here. A better way is to jump to the keyframe because then you know you're on that exact keyframe point. Occasionally people move the playhead and go slightly next to the keyframe and start keyframing on that new frame. And it can get really confusing if you have extra keyframes right next to each other. So get used to using the jump to keyframe button here. And we need to key in a 360 rotation on the Z axis. Now when we play it, it spins around nicely and still loops because of course 360 degrees is a full revolution. Okay, as a nice simple challenge to you, I want you to extend the animation so it lasts for 2 whole seconds rather than just 1. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that and that you remembered you need to change the end of your animation here to 48. So that's 2 times 24, of course. And it's also worth noting that you can type in here 24 times 2 to get 48. You can do simple maths within these boxes, and that's extended my animation. Now I need to move the keyframes. We can actually click and drag over a group of keyframes like so. But if I deselect that with Alt-A to deselect all, I can just click the top summary keyframe here, and that will select everything underneath it. So all those keyframes on my cube. If I had other objects in the scene, I would click on the cube one here. Then it would just select the cube's hierarchy. I can then G to grab and move that across to frame 48. Let's select the cube one for here as well and G to grab and move that across to frame 24. And I'm just looking at the brackets up and to the left slightly to see frame 24 and I can left click there. And if I press spacebar, you can see the animation running more slowly and over 2 seconds. So spacebar to pause that again. Now, those of you that have a little bit more experience with animation will know that I could have done that in a much easier way. If I bring my playhead to the start, and in fact, remember, I should be using those jump to keyframes or jump to start even here. I can actually select all with A and press the scale button and it will scale in towards my playhead. And that's a nice easy way to extend out the length of an animation. And we'll be doing that a little bit more in the future as well. But hopefully you didn't find that too challenging and you're ready to move on. We will be using this file, so make sure you save your work ready for next time.